There's an old phrase that used to mean something very different than it means today: your money or your life. Picture the original scene for a second. A robber, standing in a dark road, pointing something sharp or something loaded at a stranger, forcing them to choose right there, in a single terrifying second, between the cash in their pocket and the years still left in their body. Nobody ever hesitated in that scenario. Nobody ever said, "Let me think about it. Let me weigh the pros and cons." You hand over the money every single time, because on some primal, obvious level, everyone understands that life is worth infinitely more than whatever happens to be sitting in your wallet. Here's the question that's going to sit uncomfortably with you for the rest of this video, and honestly, for a long time after it ends. If that choice is so obvious when it's a stranger holding something sharp in a dark alley, why do so many of us make the opposite choice, quietly, every single day, for decades, without a robber anywhere in sight? Why do we trade away entire years of our one, irreplaceable life, hour by hour, morning by morning, for money we don't actually need, to buy things that don't actually make us happier, chasing a finish line that keeps moving every single time we get close to it? There was a man who asked himself that exact question decades ago, and the answer he found was so unsettling, so completely contrary to how most people are taught to think about work and money, that it eventually reshaped an entire movement of people determined to stop trading their lives away without noticing. His name was Joe Dominguez, and before we get into what he discovered, I need you to understand exactly where he was standing when he first asked the question, because the contrast is going to matter more than you'd expect. Joe worked on Wall Street, not casually, not for a few years to pay off student loans. He worked there as a technical analyst, deeply embedded in the exact machine that convinces millions of people every single day that more money is always the answer, that the next raise, the next bonus, and somewhere inside that machine, surrounded by people chasing bigger numbers on bigger screens, Joe did something almost nobody around him was doing. He stopped, and he actually did the math on his own life. Not the math on his portfolio, the math on his hours. He calculated, with brutal, almost obsessive precision, the commute, the clothes required for the job, the stress-related habits that quietly drained money right back out of his pocket after a long, exhausting day, the recovery time he needed afterward, just to feel human enough to do it all again the next morning. And when he finished that calculation, when he actually looked at the true cost of his income, laid out honestly in front of him, something in Joe Dominguez shifted permanently. By the time he was 31 years old, Joe retired. Not because he'd won some enormous windfall, not because he'd built a business that sold for millions, because he'd figured out, with startling clarity, exactly how much money he actually needed to live the life he genuinely wanted, and the moment his savings crossed that specific line, he simply stopped trading any more of his life away for money he didn't need. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand the exact framework Joe built to figure that number out for himself. A framework so simple, it almost sounds insultingly basic, and yet so rarely applied by people who are otherwise brilliant with every other part of their lives. And somewhere in the middle of all this, we're going to talk about a concept called life energy. One single idea that, once you actually understand it, makes it almost impossible to look at a receipt, a paycheck, or a Tuesday morning alarm clock. Let's start with the trap itself, because you can't understand the escape without first understanding exactly how deep the hole actually goes. Picture a woman named Carol, a marketing manager in her late 30s, the kind of person most people would describe as successful without a second thought. Good salary, nice apartment, A closet full of clothes that look exactly like the ones her coworkers wear. A calendar packed with enough commitments that she genuinely can't remember the last time she had an entire free Saturday. Carl had never actually calculated her real hourly wage before, not once in her entire career. And when she finally did, using a method we're going to walk through together in a few minutes, the number that came out the other end genuinely stunned her. Her real hourly wage, after accounting for every single work-related expense, every recovery hour, every dollar spent specifically because her job existed, was less than half of what her paycheck alone suggested. Less than half. She sat with that number for a long time, staring at it on a notepad in her kitchen, doing the math over and over, half expecting to find an error somewhere, because surely it couldn't actually be that low. It was, and here's the part that made it genuinely painful for her to accept. The specific detail that this entire framework forces you to confront whether you're ready for it or not. Every single dollar she spent, on anything, on everything, from her rent to her lunch, to the jacket she bought on a whim last month, had to be measured not in dollars anymore, but in hours of her actual life. Hours she would never, under any circumstances, get back. This is the core idea underneath everything we're about to explore together, and I want you to really let it land, because most people go their entire lives without ever consciously naming it, even though it quietly governs nearly every decision they make. Money isn't really money. Money is a stand-in, a proxy, a symbol for something far more valuable and far more limited, which is your life energy, the actual hours of your one finite existence that you traded away in order to earn it. When you buy something for $50, you're not really spending $50. You're spending however many hours of your actual life it took you to earn that $50, after every single cost of earning it has been honestly subtracted. And once you start seeing money this way, seeing every purchase as a direct trade against your own limited hours on this earth, something happens that Joe Dominguez discovered decades ago, and that thousands of people have discovered since. Spending starts to feel completely different, not because you're suddenly deprived or forced into some grim, joyless austerity, because you finally have an honest, accurate exchange rate. And once you have that, you get to actually choose, consciously, deliberately, exactly which purchases are genuinely worth the hours of your life they cost, and which ones you've simply been making on autopilot, without ever once doing the math. Let's slow down here, because this is where the framework actually starts to become useful, not just interesting. Joe Dominguez, along with his collaborator Vicki, built a specific process for calculating your real hourly wage, and it's more layered than most people expect the first time they try it. Here's how it actually works. Start with your total income, but don't stop there, because your gross paycheck is almost never the honest number. Subtract the actual hours you spend working, including every bit of unpaid overtime that never shows up on a timesheet. Then subtract the hours you spend specifically because of your job, hours that wouldn't exist in your life at all if that particular job disappeared tomorrow. Your commute, every single week, every single year, quietly stacking up into weeks and months of your life you'll genuinely never get back. The time spent getting ready in a way you specifically wouldn't bother with if you weren't heading into an office or a client meeting. The decompression time after a stressful day, the hours spent staring blankly at a screen because your brain is simply too fried from work to do anything else, even though you're technically off the clock. Now factor in the money, not just the time, that your job specifically requires you to spend, the work wardrobe you'd never have purchased otherwise, the convenience meals you buy because you're too exhausted to cook after a long commute, and a long day. The stress-related spending, the retail therapy, the extra glass of wine, the subscription services you barely use but keep paying for because canceling anything feels like one more decision you don't have the energy for. Once you add up every single one of these hidden costs, both in time and in money, and you divide your actual take-home pay by your actual total hours invested, something remarkable happens. The number almost always drops, sometimes by a shocking amount, and suddenly you're looking at your real hourly wage for the very first time in your entire working life. There's a man in this story, let's call him Walter, an accountant who ran this exact calculation on himself after hearing about it from a coworker, half expecting to feel reassured, since accountants, if anyone, are supposed to be good with numbers. Instead, Walter discovered that after accounting for his commute, his dry cleaning bills, his daily coffee habit that had started purely as a way to survive early meetings, and the 2 nights a week he was simply too drained to cook and ordered takeout instead, his real hourly wage was almost a third lower than the number printed on his paycheck. A third lower. He described the moment he finished that calculation as one of the strangest of his entire adult life, sitting at his own kitchen table with a legal pad full of numbers, realizing that the job he'd always described to people as well-paying was, once you counted everything honestly, paying him considerably less than he'd been telling himself for over a decade. Here's the question I want you to actually sit with for a moment, the same one Walter sat with that night at his kitchen table. If you calculated your own real hourly wage right now, honestly, including every hidden cost your job quietly requires, what number would actually come out the other end? And, more importantly, would that number change how you think about the next purchase you're about to make? Because once Joe Dominguez had this framework fully built, he applied it to something even more powerful than a single calculation. He applied it to every single transaction in his entire life. This next part sounds almost absurd when you first hear it, and yet it's precisely the piece of the program that produces the most dramatic transformations in the people who actually follow through with it. Step 1 of the entire 9-step program Joe and Vicki eventually built together is this. Go back through every financial record you can find and calculate the total amount of money you've earned across your entire life, from your very first paycheck to whatever you earned last month. Not your net worth, your total lifetime earnings, every single dollar that has ever passed through your hands. For most people, this number is enormous, far larger than they ever expected, sometimes running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes well past $1 million, even for people who have never once felt genuinely wealthy at any point in their lives. There's a woman in the program's history, a school teacher who calculated her lifetime earnings and discovered she had personally earned, over the course of her career, well over $1 million. And when she finished that calculation, she sat in stunned silence for several minutes because, by any reasonable measure, she should have felt rich, should have had substantial savings and real financial breathing room, and yet she was living paycheck to paycheck, with almost nothing set aside, exactly like she had for years. Where had $1 million actually gone? This is precisely the question the second half of the program forces you to confront, and it's genuinely uncomfortable in the most useful possible way. Step 2 asks you to track every single dollar you spend, going forward, in complete, granular detail. No category too small, no purchase too embarrassing to write down honestly, not a rough, monthly budget estimate. Every single transaction tracked with total honesty, no matter how uncomfortable that honesty turns out to be. And then, once a month, you take all of that tracked spending and you organize it into specific, meaningful categories. Categories that actually reflect your real life rather than generic budgeting labels that mean almost nothing. Not just food, restaurant meals eaten alone out of sheer exhaustion, separated from groceries bought with genuine intention. Not just entertainment, streaming subscriptions you actually watch, separated honestly from the ones you completely forgot you were even paying for. This granular honesty is where the real transformation actually begins to happen. Because once you see your spending laid out this specifically, patterns start to emerge that were completely invisible before. Patterns you'd never have noticed from a vague monthly total alone. There's a couple in this story, the Ellisons, who went through this exact process together, and about 4 months in, something jumped out at them that neither of them had ever consciously noticed before. They were spending nearly $300 a month on convenience purchases made specifically during the 90 minutes immediately after they each got home from work. Snacks, delivery orders, small impulse purchases made online while decompressing on the couch. None of it planned, all of it happening during the exact window of the day when they were both most mentally and physically depleted. $300 a month, month after month, year after year, spent almost entirely because of exhaustion rather than genuine desire or actual need. When they translated that number into hours of life energy, using the real hourly wage calculation from earlier, the number became even more striking, representing several full days of their actual, irreplaceable lives every single year, traded away not for anything they particularly valued, but simply because they were too tired to make a more conscious decision in that specific window of time. This is where the framework becomes genuinely powerful, because Joe and Vicki never argued that spending itself is bad or that deprivation is somehow noble. Their actual argument was something far more interesting and honestly far more liberating once you fully absorb it. Every purchase deserves to be measured against a single, honest question. Did this specific expenditure of my life energy bring me a proportional amount of fulfillment in return? Not happiness in some vague, abstract sense. Fulfillment, specifically, genuinely, measured against the actual hours of life it cost you to acquire. They built something they called the fulfillment curve, and it's worth walking through carefully because it explains something almost everyone has experienced, but very few people have ever actually named. Imagine a simple curve rising from the bottom left toward the top right. At the very start of that curve, when a person has almost nothing, additional money and additional spending produce a genuinely enormous increase in actual happiness and fulfillment because you're moving from real deprivation toward having your basic needs consistently met, and that transition matters enormously to how a human life actually feels day to day. But the curve doesn't rise forever in a straight line. At a certain point, and this point is different for every single person, the curve starts to bend, then flatten, and for some people, it eventually starts curving back downward entirely. That downward bend represents something researchers and everyday people alike have noticed for decades without always having good language for it. The strange, uncomfortable truth that past a certain point, more stuff, more spending, more square footage, more subscriptions, more possessions, doesn't actually add more fulfillment at all. Sometimes it actively subtracts from it, adding clutter, added maintenance, additional financial pressure, more things to organize, clean, insure, and worry about. There's a term Joe and Vicki used for the exact peak of that curve, the specific point where spending and fulfillment are perfectly, precisely balanced, where every additional dollar spent brings genuinely proportional additional fulfillment in return, and not a cent more than that. They called it enough. And here's the twist that makes this idea so quietly radical, so different from almost everything else our culture teaches us about money. Enough isn't a fixed number. It's not some universal dollar amount everyone should be striving toward. It's a deeply personal point, different for every single person, based entirely on their own individual values. Outside, most people, according to this framework, have never actually found their own personal enough. They've simply kept climbing the curve indefinitely, assuming, without ever really questioning it, that more will always continue to mean better, right up until the day they retire, or burn out completely, or finally stop long enough to ask themselves whether any of it actually made them happier along the way. Here's a pause worth taking right now, honestly, with no one else watching. Think about the last significant purchase you made, something that cost real money, something you thought about before buying. Did it move you closer to your own personal enough, or did it push you further up a curve that had already started bending downward for you, quietly, without you ever consciously noticing the shift? Now, let's talk about the part of this framework that genuinely changes lives. The part that took Joe Dominguez from a stressed Wall Street analyst to a retired 31-year-old with more genuine freedom than most people ever experience across their entire working lives. It's called the crossover point, and understanding it requires bringing together everything we've walked through so far. Once you know your real hourly wage, once you're tracking every dollar you spend with total honesty, and once you understand your own personal version of enough, you can start doing something most people never do. You can chart two separate lines on the exact same graph, month by month, year by year. The first line represents your actual monthly expenses, the honest number, the one reflecting your real life, not some idealized version of it. The second line represents the monthly income generated by your accumulated savings and investment, growing steadily over time as you continue putting money aside. At the very start, these two lines are nowhere near each other, with your investment income sitting far below your monthly expenses, which makes complete sense since you're still early in the process. But if you consistently spend less than you earn, and you consistently invest the difference, something remarkable begins to happen over months and years. The gap between those two lines starts closing, slowly at first, almost invisibly. And then, as your investments compound and grow, more and more rapidly, eventually, for people who stick with this process long enough, the two lines actually cross. The income generated by your investments finally exceeds your actual monthly expenses, meaning your money is now, quite literally, earning enough on its own to cover your entire life, without you needing to trade a single additional hour of your own remaining life energy for it. That crossing point is exactly what Joe Dominguez reached at 31 years old, and it's precisely why he was able to retire so young. Not because he'd accumulated some enormous fortune by conventional standards, but because he had deliberately, consciously kept his own expenses low enough, and his own personal definition of enough clear enough that the crossover point arrived for him decades earlier than it does for most people chasing a much larger, much less examined target. There's a woman in the broader history of this movement, a nurse named Judith, who discovered this framework in her mid-40s, already feeling like she'd missed her window, already assuming that early retirement was something reserved for people who'd started decades earlier or who'd earned significantly more than her nursing salary ever provided. But Judith ran the numbers anyway, calculated her own real hourly wage, tracked her spending with total honesty for the first time in her adult life, and discovered something that genuinely surprised her. Her personal version of enough was significantly lower than she'd always assumed it needed to be, not because she was depriving herself, but because a great deal of her previous spending had never actually been moving her up that fulfillment curve at all. It had simply been happening on autopilot, driven by habit and comparison, rather than any genuine increase in her actual quality of life. Within 7 years of adopting this framework, tracking every dollar, questioning every purchase against her own honest fulfillment curve, and redirecting the difference into consistent, patient investing, Judith reached her own crossover point at 52, a full 13 years earlier than she'd ever imagined possible when she first started. This is the part of the story that tends to land hardest for people encountering it for the first time, and it's worth sitting with directly. This entire framework was never really about retiring early for its own sake, or about deprivation dressed up as wisdom. It was about something far more fundamental, something that circles all the way back to that phrase we started with: your money or your life. Because every single hour you spend earning money you don't actually need, chasing a version of enough you've never consciously defined for yourself, is an hour of your one, irreplaceable life that you will never, under any circumstances, get back. And every hour you reclaim, through honest tracking, through a clear-eyed understanding of your own real hourly wage, through a genuine personal answer to what enough actually means for you specifically, is an hour handed directly back to your actual life, to spend however you genuinely choose. Let's bring this into the world you're actually living in right now. Because the truth is, Joe Dominguez and Vicki built this framework decades ago in a very different economic landscape, and yet the core mechanics of it have arguably become even more relevant since then, not less. Today, the forces working to keep you far above your own personal enough are more sophisticated, more constant, and more difficult to notice than they were when this framework was first built. Every app on your phone is engineered, quite literally, by teams of people whose entire job is making the next purchase feel effortless, frictionless, disconnected from any real sense of what it's actually costing you in terms of your own finite life energy. One tap, no visible cash-changing hands, no tangible sense of the hours you traded to earn that money in the first place. Subscription services multiply quietly in the background of modern life, each one small enough on its own to avoid triggering any real scrutiny, collectively adding up to a substantial, often completely unexamined portion of most people's monthly spending. The fulfillment curve itself has arguably become harder to read clearly, because an entire economy of curated images and staged moments constantly suggests that other people's spending is bringing them enormous fulfillment, even when, statistically, it very often isn't, even when the person posting that photo is, in reality, sitting somewhere well past their own personal enough, on the declining side of their own curve, without any visible sign of it in the picture itself. Here's the modern application worth actually acting on this week, something concrete, something genuinely doable in the next few days, if you're willing to sit with a bit of initial discomfort. Calculate your own real hourly wage, honestly, including every hidden cost your job quietly requires of you. The commute, the wardrobe, the recovery time, the stress-related spending you've never actually attributed back to your job before. Then, for just the next 7 days, track every single dollar you spend, no matter how small, no matter how embarrassing, translating each purchase into the actual hours of your life it genuinely cost you. You don't need to change a single habit yet, not during this first week. You simply need to see the honest numbers clearly, probably for the very first time in your entire life, and ask yourself, purchase by purchase, whether each one moved you up your own fulfillment curve, or whether it happened on autopilot, driven by habit, exhaustion, or comparison rather than any real, conscious choice. That single week of honest tracking is precisely how this entire transformation begins for nearly everyone who eventually reaches their own crossover point, whether that point arrives in 10 years, or 20, or for a fortunate few who start young and keep their own personal enough clearly defined considerably sooner than anyone around them would ever expect. Let's return, one final time, to Joe Dominguez, sitting on Wall Street decades ago, surrounded by people chasing bigger numbers on bigger screens, doing the one calculation almost nobody else in that entire building had ever bothered to do. He didn't discover some secret investment strategy unavailable to everyone else. He didn't inherit some enormous fortune that quietly made all of this possible for him and nobody else. He simply asked himself, with total honesty, exactly how much of his one finite life he was willing to keep trading for money he didn't actually need. And once he had that honest answer clearly in front of him, everything else in his life reorganized itself around it. That's the actual heartbeat of this entire framework. Money was never really the point. It never is, and it never was. It's simply a stand-in, a proxy, a symbol for something far more valuable, far more limited, and far more worth protecting than any number on any paycheck could ever be. Your own life energy, the actual hours of your one existence, ticking away whether you're paying attention to them or not, whether you're spending them consciously on things that genuinely bring you fulfillment, or spending them on autopilot, one unexamined purchase at a time, one unexamined workday at a time, trading away hours you will never, under any circumstances, get back. If this reframing of money changed anything for you today, even slightly, there's a simple, easy way to make sure you never miss the next story like this one. And honestly, that's really the only thing I'll ever ask of you. Because somewhere out there right now, there's another person sitting at their own kitchen table, legal pad in front of them, doing this exact calculation for the very first time, discovering, maybe for the first time in their entire adult life, exactly how much of their one irreplaceable life they've quietly been trading away, and exactly how much of it they still have left to spend, consciously, deliberately, on whatever actually brings them enough. The robber in that dark road only ever asked the question once: your money or your life? Most of us, without ever quite realizing it, get asked that exact same question every single day, disguised as an alarm clock, a paycheck, a purchase, a Tuesday morning. The only real difference is that we've been given the luxury this time, unlike that stranger in the dark road, of actually stopping long enough to choose